My name is Emily Harris, I'm 34 years old, and I'm a logistics officer in the United States Army. I was sitting in a secure room, reviewing personnel transfers, when a message popped up on my phone. It was from my father, Colonel Richard Harris. The subject line read, "Family Protocol." The body of the message was brief, just 14 words, "Emily, do not attend my military retirement ceremony. It is not appropriate." No greeting, no explanation, just that. The room was silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. I stared at my phone screen, my fingers hovering over the keypad for a moment, and then I typed just one word, "Understood." No one around me knew that my father, an officer admired for his leadership and family values, had just excluded me from the most significant event of his military career. His only daughter, who also wore the same uniform. But, to be honest, I wasn't surprised. My father always had a very clear vision of what the family's military legacy should be: masculine, imposing, and always prominent. From childhood, he dedicated himself to grooming my older brother, Andrew, to be the next Harris to wear the uniform. Even after Andrew dropped out of the military academy and went into the business world, my father still believed he would be the successor. Meanwhile, I was commissioned through OCS, served overseas twice, managed operations under pressure at military bases, and had soldiers who followed me with dedication. But none of that seemed to matter. I was the girl, the backup, the quiet one, lacking command presence, as my father used to say. Funny how that never stopped me from being promoted faster than most. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, he would finally see what I was doing. But in reality, even if I was holding the unit together with duct tape and coffee, he never showed up for my promotion ceremonies. Never. He used to say the Army was a difficult place for women. But I was starting to realize that what he really meant was that he didn't want me there. You know that moment when you realize someone doesn't just ignore you, but actively disdains you for who you are? That's exactly what I felt as I sat alone in a government office, staring at my phone screen. If you've ever had a family member perceive your achievements as a threat, leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. Some of us don't receive applause at home, we earn it on our own. Anyway, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the wall for a moment. Then, out of nowhere, the memory of the $1.5 million loan resurfaced in my mind. I had co-signed that loan 3 years prior, when my father called me with a sense of urgency, stating that Harris Veterans Housing required funding for expansion. The bank needed a co-signer with stronger credit to secure a favorable interest rate. His credit was tied up in other ventures. "It's just paperwork," he promised. "Family helps family." And, like an idiot, I agreed. At the time, I still believed I was part of the family. I hadn't thought about it for months, but now, rereading that cold, impersonal email, with the words, "Do not come to my military retirement ceremony," everything clicked into place. It wasn't just personal. It was financial. I was still bound to him in a way he could exploit, but emotionally, I was already dead weight. So now, the question that arose was, if I'm not good enough to be seen in uniform at your farewell, am I still good enough to bankroll your loan? I opened my laptop again, not to review personnel transfers, but to search through old files. The loan agreement, the email chain, the co-signing forms. Everything was there, scanned and saved. All legally binding. I had already done him a favor once, but he made it clear that favor was no longer reciprocal. And when you cease to be useful to someone like my father, they don't just discard you, they erase you. But what happens when you erase yourself first? I grew up in a family that never truly saw me. I didn't tell anyone about the email or what I was planning. That night, after a meeting with the operations team, I drew the blinds in my room and sat on the floor with my laptop. I opened my savings spreadsheet, my credit report, and that old loan agreement I'd signed with my father. Everything was there: my name as guarantor, the $1.5 million amount, the purpose of construction for veteran housing. At the time, he had led me to believe it was a noble cause. Who wouldn't want to support something that would help get veterans off the streets? And yes, I did ask some questions about how the financing was structured, why my name was required, but he brushed off all my concerns as if they were a nuisance. Emily, you're overthinking this, it's merely a formality. You have an excellent credit history, and they prefer to see strong co-signatories. You'll never have to pay a single cent. I believed him, and that's on me. But the more I scrutinized the documents, the clearer one thing became: my name was bearing far more of the heavy lifting than I had ever imagined. There was no clause protecting me should anything go awry. No contingency if the venture failed. I wasn't even listed on the foundation's board. I had no voice in the decisions. This wasn't a family project, it was merely my signature propping up a house of cards. I took a deep breath, and my hand didn't tremble. This surprised me. In the Army, we learned about risks, operational risk, strategic risk, but no one teaches you how it feels when your own family turns you into a liability. The sense of frustration was almost palpable. I was delving into everything I knew about that loan, sifting through and reviewing every page, every email, and soon realized I had been used as a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. That money, that loan, wasn't merely a transaction. It was the key to something far grander, something my father used to maintain control over our entire history, our family, and now, my name was at the heart of it. I wasn't going to let this be in vain. I moved away from the computer, closed the laptop, and leaned back in my chair. I stared at the ceiling, attempting to process everything that was unfolding. How could I have been so blind? How could I have believed that if I just worked hard enough, he would finally see me as something more than a mere shadow of what he wanted me to be? I had always been the alternative, the girl meant to fill my brother's shoes, the fallback for a family that only valued a traditional model of success, and my name was never enough for him. I thought of Gabriel, my brother, and how he had always been the favorite, the chosen one. The idea of leadership, of legacy, of a name that would need to be passed down through generations. He had been my father's chosen successor from the outset. Which made sense given my father's clear archetype, a man in a position of authority, bearing a name that was meant to resonate. When Gabriel deviated from that path, my father did not take kindly to it, yet his expectations remained unaltered. The pressure on me was immense. Ultimately, however, my father had not anticipated that I would be so capable of shouldering everything on my own. He never believed I was competent enough for it. I gazed at the computer screen and drew a deep breath. I knew I could no longer permit him to exploit me as he always had. It was already abundantly clear that he held no regard for me. He did not even desire my presence at his most significant event. This was a reflection of a profound disdain. Something that had always simmered beneath the surface, merely awaiting the opportune moment to manifest itself. I decided I no longer wished to be part of my family's legacy, not the kind of legacy he intended for me to uphold. I was determined to sever ties once and for all, to begin forging my own narrative. I could no longer remain shackled to this name, to this history. Not when my father refused to acknowledge my true self. He was coercing me into believing I had to follow his path, his desires for me, when, in reality, I was capable of achieving something far grander. When I made the decision, it was not an easy one. There was a great deal at stake. I understood the repercussions it would entail. Yet I also knew that by making this choice, I would finally be free. Free to chart my own course and embrace the truth of who I wanted to become, unburdened by the shackles of a limiting legacy. Even if the cost was steep, I knew it was the sole way forward. I looked at the loan agreement again. It lay there, conspicuous, my name inextricably linked to a commitment I should never have undertaken. It wasn't merely financial, it was deeply emotional. My relationship with my father had never been genuine. It had always been predicated on his expectations of me and a form of love that manifested as an obligation. This had to end now. I closed the laptop and rose from my chair. I gazed out my bedroom window, observing the city at night, illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. I felt that, somewhere, freedom awaited me. But to attain it, I needed to act. I knew my family would not comprehend my decision. It didn't matter. They had never understood my choices. I retrieved my phone and dialed my attorney, Rachel. "Rachel, I need your assistance," I stated, my voice resolute. Of course, Emily. What has transpired? I wish to revoke my guarantee on that loan. I want to extricate myself from this entire entanglement. I demand my freedom. Understood, she replied, already taking diligent notes. I'll see to everything required. I'll prepare the necessary documentation for the withdrawal. It was then that Rachel posed a question that truly caught me off guard. Emily, have you ever considered a career outside the Army? Something that involves more strategic thinking and less of the battlefield? I looked at her, taken aback by the suggestion. Not that the idea was unappealing, but I had never genuinely contemplated it. I don't know, I replied thoughtfully. I've always been so singularly focused on the mission, on service. But perhaps it's time to think beyond that. She smiled knowingly. I know you possess what it takes to succeed in any field. Emily. What you've accomplished with your career and the way you've surmounted all that transpired. That is true leadership. Who knows what else you might achieve if you start to perceive yourself in a different light. Those words resonated with me. I had always known that my true aptitude lay in leadership, in making arduous decisions under duress, but the notion of expanding my horizons beyond the Army, of exploring new avenues, was something I hadn't previously entertained. Following that conversation with Rachel, I began to contemplate the possibilities that might exist beyond my military career. I wasn't prepared to entirely relinquish my Army service, not by any means, but I sensed there might be alternative avenues to leverage the proficiencies I had cultivated over the years. Strategy, leadership, resilience, I possessed the requisite tools to forge ahead and surmount new challenges. Consequently, I resolved to pursue something beyond my current assignment. I matriculated in strategic management courses and commenced engaging with several external initiatives affiliated with the corporate sphere, aiming to ascertain if this nascent path would captivate me. I was acutely aware that, irrespective of the trajectory I ultimately chose, the Army would remain an indelible part of my identity. However, I was now unlocking doors to a more expansive future, one where I could synthesize what I had gained from the Army with novel knowledge and experiences. The transition proved to be anything but facile. On numerous occasions, I found myself grappling with whether I was, in fact, pursuing the appropriate course of action. The Army had afforded me stability, earned respect, and perpetual challenges. It represented the entirety of my lived experience. Yet, I was equally cognizant that, to foster ongoing development, I needed to challenge myself in novel ways. I eschewed the notion of being perceived solely as the colonel's daughter. I aspired to be acknowledged as Emily Walker, an individual with broader contributions to offer the world. Then, the unforeseen summons materialized. I was in a meeting with some of my senior colleagues when my phone buzzed on the table. It was an email, and upon seeing the sender, I couldn't help but smile. It was an invitation from a highly reputable strategic consulting firm, offering a position to work with a specialized team focused on operations optimization. The proposal was truly compelling. The salary, the conditions, the role, everything was there, before me, like a gateway to an uncharted future. I took a moment to process the offer. I knew it would be a profound transition. Moving from the Army to the corporate world would be anything but simple. But, simultaneously, I felt this was the chance to truly redefine who I was. I knew there was much more to me than the military routine, and perhaps it was time to prove that to the world, and, more significantly, to myself. With Rachel's support and after much deliberation, I accepted the offer. The decision was a watershed moment. It wasn't a farewell to the Army, but rather an expansion of my vision. I was finally poised for a new chapter. The next step would be to leverage all the skills I had honed during my military career, leadership, difficult decision-making, execution under pressure, to forge something even more impactful in the corporate world. The first month at the new company was challenging. I found myself in a novel environment, with a distinct set of expectations and pressures. Meetings were more rapid, more direct. The culture was more dynamic, yet, in a way, I had been primed for it. What surprised me was the seamlessness with which I could apply my strategic mindset and my aptitude for problem-solving under pressure, abilities I had cultivated throughout my Army career. I was learning, adapting to this new phase, but I felt that, with each passing day, I was growing stronger. IT was no longer about adhering to a prescribed path. It was about charting my own course, taking the reins of my professional life based on my own values and convictions. And then, suddenly, I became acutely aware of something I had never before observed. The world outside the Army, while undeniably more competitive, offered me greater latitude to truly be myself. I was beginning to see myself in a new light. A way that was no longer bound to anyone's shadow. My father's legacy was definitively behind me, and now, what I was building was unequivocally mine. Time passed, and I was achieving more than I had anticipated. The new position challenged me daily, but it also revealed to me a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I knew my journey wouldn't have been the same without the lessons learned throughout my life. The Army taught me resilience, discipline, and how to fight for my objectives. And now, in the corporate world, I was leveraging all of that to conquer new horizons. I gazed out the window of my new office, the city skyline spread out before me. The sense of accomplishment was unparalleled. I had come so far, but this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. The phone rang. It was Rachel. "Emily, you're truly thriving. I always knew there was more to you than just military life. You're writing your own story now." I smiled, listening to her words of encouragement. "Yes, I am. And finally, I'm in control of my destiny." As the years unfolded, each decision, each transformation, propelled me closer to the woman I had always known I was destined to become. I was no longer deriving my self-worth from the validation of others or an appellation that was not my own. I was forging my own legacy, crafting my own narrative. And with every new challenge that arose, I found myself growing stronger, becoming more self-assured, and increasingly certain of my true identity. I had never envisioned my life unfolding in this manner, but now that I had arrived at this juncture, I understood that everything had transpired precisely as it was meant to. What had once appeared to be a loss, an insurmountable conclusion, had metamorphosed into a profound new genesis. And, ultimately, I found myself at peace, knowing that nothing could impede my progress. I conferred with her for several more minutes, providing the specifics of the loan and outlining the requisite procedures. I was under no illusion that things would be straightforward, but I was prepared to contend. This marked my initial stride. I knew that by doing this, a cascade of repercussions would be triggered. My father would certainly not condone it, nor would Gabriel, or indeed, anyone else. They would undoubtedly attempt to blame me, to pressure me into recanting, to re-enter their narrative once more. But, deep down, I knew this had become utterly devoid of meaning. Not anymore. The following morning, I rose early and headed to the office, as was my custom. I accessed the facility, logged into the secure system, and commenced my daily regimen of briefings and reports. Yet, internally, the maelstrom of emotions proved difficult to quell. I knew my decision to withdraw my loan collateral would not go unnoticed. This was not merely a financial contract, it was a declaration of independence. My father's, and Gabriel's, reaction would likely be devastating, but now, more than ever, I understood the imperative to act. My identity and the future I so ardently desired were at stake. That afternoon, the phone rang, and upon seeing the name displayed, I knew precisely who was calling: my father, Colonel Richard Harris. I hesitated for a moment, but answered. There was no longer room for fear, I was resolute. He needed to comprehend that I was no longer an appendage of his empire. "Emily," he stated, his voice a resonant baritone, as if striving to maintain composure. "What are you doing? This is madness. You will dismantle everything our family has built. This foundation, this reputation, you are obliterating it all." I took a deep breath. "I am not destroying anything, Father. I am merely, at long last, asserting control over my own life. And I will no longer permit you to dictate my decisions." He paused, clearly taken aback by my retort. You cannot do this, Emily. You are an integral part of our legacy. This name, this standing, they signify something. You cannot simply extricate yourself from it. I almost laughed, but restrained myself. I have already detached myself. I have always existed in its shadow. Now is the time to forge my own narrative, unburdened by the weight of your name. His voice grew more taut. This is egregious selfishness. And you will come to regret it. I will do whatever is necessary to safeguard what we have painstakingly constructed. I clenched my jaw. I am no longer safeguarding anything you have built. What you have done is manipulate, control, and exploit everyone around you. This ends now. He disconnected without another word. And in that instant, the final tether connecting me to that legacy was severed. I was free. Free to forge my own path, unencumbered by the constant pressure to be someone I am not. Yet, this newfound liberty came at a cost. I knew my family, particularly my brother Gabriel, would not comprehend. They would perceive me as the betrayer, the daughter who irrevocably tarnished the family name. But, unlike them, I was doing what felt intrinsically right for me. I was forging something predicated not upon anyone else's expectations, but solely on my own choices. As dusk settled, I met with Rachel again to finalize the legal specifics. Everything is set, Emily, she stated as she perused the documents. Should you proceed with the withdrawal, there will be no turning back. They will feel the pressure. And you likely will too. My gaze fell upon the documents, my name emblazoned in black ink across multiple pages, and I drew a deep breath. My decision is made. It's time to move forward. She nodded. I understand. Let's do this. The process of withdrawing my collateral proved more intricate than I had anticipated. I began to grasp the profound extent to which my actions would impact not only the foundation, but also my familial relationships. Every stride I made was distancing me further from what I had known as a family. Yet I knew that in doing so, I was moving away from something that had never truly been mine. In the ensuing weeks, the repercussions of my actions began to ripple outward swiftly. My father was seized with panic when he realized the foundation was beginning to crumble. Investigations commenced, creditors began to exert pressure, and, before long, the financial irregularities he had attempted to conceal began to surface. Concurrently, my professional life was gaining momentum. I was being promoted, my team held me in high regard, and I was finally being recognized as a leader. Yet every advancement I made in my career seemed to be accompanied by the burden of increasing personal losses. Messages from Gabriel began to flood my phone. He was relentless. I knew his objective. He wanted me to recant, to retreat to the perceived security of his familial vision. But I could not. I disregarded the messages and adhered to my routine, but I knew I couldn't evade him indefinitely. I would eventually have to confront my brother. And I knew his reaction would be far from facile to manage. The evening I finally found an opportune moment to address one of Gabriel's messages, he was on the other end of the line, palpably incensed. Emily, do you comprehend the magnitude of your actions? You've utterly destroyed everything. You've alienated yourself from us, from the family, from the legacy. You have no conception of what will now transpire with all of this, do you? I listened to him, refraining from interruption. I knew he was incensed, but what he failed to grasp, what no one seemed to comprehend, was that I was no longer willing to be part of a legacy that had never truly been mine. I never wanted it. I never needed it. Gabriel, I stated, my voice calm yet resolute. I am doing what is right. I can no longer be a part of something that is tearing me apart from within. He paused, evidently struggling to process my words. I no longer know what to say. I'm not sure if I can support you in this. I took a deep breath. I don't expect your support. I merely want you to understand that I am doing this for myself. And, ultimately, you will see that I made the right decision. He hung up without another word. There was nothing left to say. In the days that followed, the sensation of being in control of my life grew stronger. I knew that repercussions would follow, but I also knew I could no longer allow myself to be dominated by my father's narrative. The ramifications of my actions were swiftly felt. My father, who had always possessed the ability to keep everything under control, was now in a vulnerable position. I observed him, from a distance, attempting to do everything possible to maintain the foundation's facade. But the fissures were evident, and no one could ignore them any longer. With each new message I received from Gabriel, I distanced myself further. He simply couldn't comprehend. I knew he was angry, but the truth was he was more concerned with what he stood to lose than with what was happening to me. It was the same pattern. For him, the family name, the foundation, the legacy had always held greater importance. But I was no longer a pawn in that game. Then, the news began to disseminate. The foundation, without my guarantee on the loan, started to succumb to financial collapse. Investors began to retract their commitments. My father was endeavoring to protect the foundation's image, but the situation was spiraling out of control. He attempted to control the narrative, but he knew he was losing the battle. I, conversely, moved forward with my life. In my professional life, my team began to notice a palpable difference. I was no longer striving to appease others. Now, I was making decisions in alignment with my own vision, with what I believed to be righteous. This transformation did not go unnoticed. I began to be perceived as a true leader, an individual capable of making difficult decisions, and who, at last, was in command of her own destiny. Yet, the specters of the past still lingered. The full gravity of my decision began to weigh on me more heavily than anticipated. It transcended mere familial concerns. There was a profound sense that, in some way, I still bore the indelible marks of all the years I had spent striving for my father's approval. I knew I couldn't expunge that past, yet the sheer act of making my own choices imbued me with a profound sense of relief. I was, at long last, authoring my own narrative. As the pressure mounted, a steely resolve solidified within me. I was poised to confront whatever lay ahead. I knew my father would attempt to manipulate me once more. It was his invariable modus operandi. But I was no longer inclined to acquiesce. I was confident that, ultimately, he would not be able to dismantle me. My identity was now being forged by my own deliberate choices, and that reality was immutable. That weekend, following a fraught meeting with the team, I resolved to carve out some time for introspection. I required a sanctuary to process the unfolding events. I opted to seek solace in a place that had always afforded me tranquility, a modest park adjacent to the base. I settled onto a bench, observing the canopy of trees and feeling the gentle caress of the wind on my skin. It felt as though the external world had decelerated, allowing me to finally discern my own thoughts unburdened by the relentless weight of external expectations. What struck me most profoundly was the palpable sense of liberation. I was imbued with a buoyancy I hadn't known for a considerable period. The decision I had made was far from facile, but now, removed from all that embodied my family's legacy, I finally grasped the true essence of freedom. The tranquil moment was abruptly shattered by the insistent ring of my phone. It was Rachel, my attorney. "Emily," she stated, her voice tinged with gravity, "the bank has already acknowledged receipt of your formal request to revoke the collateral. We are proceeding with the process, but the repercussions are beginning to surface. Your father is exerting considerable pressure for you to recant." I drew a steadying breath. "That is not going to transpire, Rachel. My decision is resolute." She paused momentarily. "I recognize your strength, but you must brace yourself for what lies ahead. He will not yield without a protracted struggle." "I am aware," I responded. "But I am no longer tethered to that. I understand the implications of my actions, and I am certain this is the correct course." In the days that followed, the gravity of my decision began to truly sink in. The financial impact on the foundation was profound. My father endeavored to stabilize matters, but the truth was that the foundation was being consumed by a pervasive lack of transparency and the sheer neglect stemming from countless ill-conceived decisions made over the years. And, however much he attempted to control the narrative, I knew the truth would inevitably surface, sooner or later. I understood it would be impossible for him to conceal the foundation's impending insolvency, yet he was still striving to protect his reputation. To him, the name, the image, the foundation itself, always held precedence over the individuals around him. He simply could not comprehend that I was unshackling myself from a legacy that was never truly mine. For him, family was merely a vehicle for prestige and achievement, not a source of genuine love or unwavering support. The emails began to trickle in, Gabriel's messages escalated. He wanted me to recant, to help salvage what little remained. But the reality was I no longer had any interest in upholding an empire that had never been built upon a foundation of respect or consideration. I was weary of constantly trying to appease everyone. I was exhausted from being viewed as nothing more than a mere instrument for something greater than myself. Then, on a chilly Friday morning, my father called again. I already knew his objective. He had no desire to inquire about my well-being. He simply wanted to persuade me to relent. Emily, do you comprehend the magnitude of your actions? You cannot simply sever all ties with our family. The foundation is ours. Your name is inextricably linked to it. No, Dad. My name is no longer linked to it. I have already made my choice, I replied, unflinchingly. That he sighed, sounding weary, as if he already knew I would not recant. I only wanted you to be a part of this. You possess such potential. But now, you're going to squander it all. You're going to relegate everything we've built to ruin. I am not discarding anything. I am finally choosing who I want to be. And that does not involve you, the foundation, or any of your constructs. He fell silent for a moment. You have disappointed me, Emily. You have profoundly disappointed me. With that, he hung up. I placed my phone back on the table and took a deep breath. There was no longer any room for regret. In that moment, the decision I had made seemed to be the only judicious course of action. Every word from my father, each insidious attempt to manipulate me, only solidified my conviction that I was doing the right thing. What he failed to grasp, and likely never would, was that I no longer required his imprimatur to forge ahead. He had always presumed he could orchestrate my life, but I was shattering the shackles he had imposed upon me. At Rachel's call came through. Once more, delivering an update from the legal machinations. The bank had already initiated proceedings to compel my father's foundation to settle its debts. My withdrawal of collateral would certainly not go unnoticed. Emily, she said, the bank is exerting significant pressure for the foundation to find a path to solvency. They are demanding an accounting for the funds you co-signed. Your father is endeavoring to orchestrate events such that culpability is laid squarely at your feet. A mirthless laugh escaped me. It was ever thus. My father consistently shirked responsibility for his own transgressions. He perpetually sought a fall guy, and, in this particular scenario, I was designated for that role. His pronouncements hold no sway over me anymore, Rachel, I asserted, my tone unwavering. I am no longer beholden to the persona he sought to impose upon me. If he chooses to deflect culpability onto me, so be it. The unvarnished truth, however, is that he is merely harvesting the bitter fruit of his own actions. I comprehend. But be advised that the bank is poised to enact more drastic measures should he persist in his attempts to manipulate the situation. This could potentially tarnish your public standing. Are you braced for such an eventuality? I inhaled deeply. My eyelids fluttering shut for a fleeting moment. I was acutely aware that the ramifications would be substantial, but retreat was no longer an option. Indeed, I am fully prepared. As events transpired on the legal and financial fronts, my personal life began to devolve into a battleground. Gabriel relentlessly attempted to dissuade me, urging me to recant my actions. Our conversations grew increasingly fraught, as he once again endeavored to induce guilt. Emily, you are laying waste to everything, he declared over the phone. This will utterly ruin us. Can you not perceive that? I felt the gravity of his words, yet I remained resolute. I understood what was at stake, knew that transformation would not occur without a measure of tribulation. However, the anguish of persisting under the yoke of his and my father's expectations would be far greater. I am not destroying anything, Gabriel. I am finally seizing autonomy over my life. He fell silent for a moment, as if endeavoring to process my declaration. But you are dismantling our family, he insisted. I am not dismantling our family. I am extricating myself from it, I calmly responded. I heard his sigh from the other end of the line, and then he uttered something that, in a way, afforded me a measure of relief. I cannot assist you with this. You must navigate this path independently. And thus commenced my true odyssey. When Gabriel ceased his interventions and manipulative overtures, allowing me to forge my own path, I finally felt emancipated. It was not merely a liberation from my father, but a liberation from the entirety of what the family had come to represent. I was finally resolved to embody my authentic self, unapologetically and without compunction, yet, this newfound freedom also entailed a considerably greater burden of responsibility. I recognized that, ultimately, I alone would bear the repercussions of my choices. However, contrary to my previous apprehensions, I was prepared for it. I understood that I possessed the agency to forge my own destiny. The battle was just beginning. As the repercussions of my decision were still reverberating, attention was beginning to gravitate towards me. The bank, at my father's behest, was attempting to hold me accountable. My father's foundation was crumbling, and, inevitably, my image began to be tarnished. I was aware it would be arduous, but there was something within me that finally felt at peace. I was doing what was right for me. I was no longer compelled to shoulder the weight of a legacy that was not my own. I was beginning to perceive myself not as Richard Harris's daughter, but as Emily Harris, the woman who made choices for herself, even if those choices were arduous. I came to understand that, in due course, the support I sought from my family would not materialize. They were all so blinded by expectations, by the facade of what they believed they ought to be, that I was losing touch with everyone. Gabriel was so entrenched in what my father had always envisioned for him that he couldn't perceive that. However painful it might be, my choice was also a means of self-preservation, and thus, with each ignored message and every increasingly strained conversation, I began to comprehend that the dynamics of my family relationships were already set. My father perceived me as an extension of a legacy, but for me, the true triumph would be to become the woman I always aspired to be. Unburdened by the past, unconstrained by my father's name, the ensuing weeks proved to be intense. Every one of my actions seemed scrutinized, dissected, debated. The pressure was beginning to mount, yet, contrary to my expectations, I was not yielding. I felt more resilient than ever. Discussions with my father and Gabriel dwindled, but this did not signify the battle was concluded. Indeed, it was merely beginning to escalate. The legal ramifications were spilling over into the media. My father's foundation, bereft of my name as the loan guarantor, proved financially unsustainable. Creditors commenced collection efforts. The press, as anticipated, began to zero in on the narrative of a collapsing foundation and a seemingly defiant daughter who had rescinded her $1.5 million guarantee. My name, hitherto largely unknown, started becoming synonymous with financial impropriety and the downfall of the Harris Foundation. I was aware this would be an inherent part of the process, yet the burden of notoriety caught me off guard. Upon entering the office the following day, a palpable tension already permeated the atmosphere among my colleagues. What was previously a straightforward work routine now appeared to be scrutinized through a different lens. Queries began to surface, discreet yet incessant. What transpired with the foundation? How do you reconcile your decision with its impact on so many individuals? I had steeled myself for such inquiries. I had always been equipped to contend with external pressures. However, what I had not anticipated was the toll it would take on me personally. I was witnessing my father, the man I had always perceived as unyielding, finally unravel. He was desperately attempting to salvage his reputation, but the fabrications began to disintegrate. And he was utterly at a loss as to how to manage it. Later that day, following the conclusion of the command meeting, I was summoned for a private Discussion by my immediate superior, Colonel Davis. His gaze was circumspect, yet he was not there to pass judgment. He was merely observing me, evidently concerned about the implications for my career. Emily, I understand the gravity of the situation, and it has become a pervasive topic of discussion. However, you must grasp that the perception of the Harris Foundation, and indeed your own public image, could have significant repercussions for our operations here, he articulated with measured caution. I was well aware of his apprehension regarding the ramifications for my standing, but I was no longer inclined to cower behind the expectations of others. The deceit and machinations embodied by my father and his foundation no longer held sway over me. Colonel, I began, I understand your concern. However, my decision is resolute. Regardless of what transpires now, I refuse to be defined by this narrative any longer. He regarded me for a moment, perhaps pondering the words he had just heard. Then, he sighed and nodded. I know. But be prepared for the inevitable repercussions. Should you require support, we will be here. Just ensure you maintain your resolve. I thanked him and exited the room, feeling an even greater burden settle upon my shoulders. I understood that what was unfolding was not merely about my personal choice, but rather the arduous task of carving my own clear path, without being consumed by my family's pervasive legacy. The pressure continued to mount. And, as my father's very foundation began to crumble, he started to attack me directly, more vehemently than ever before. He simply could not reconcile himself with the fact that I had left him behind. Now, he was attempting to reframe the narrative, compelling everyone to view the story from his perspective. He cast himself as the martyr, while I was the ungrateful daughter. The woman intent on tarnishing the family name. Messages began to pour in from every quarter. Family, colleagues, individuals who had fallen under my father's sway throughout the years. They all perceived me as the betrayer. They were utterly incapable of comprehending why I had taken such a drastic measure. It was Gabriel who reached out, once more. His anger was palpable, yet a discernible note of despair resonated in his voice. He knew that, no matter how assiduously he tried, he would never compel me to recant. Emily, you cannot persist with this. You are obliterating everything. I'm not merely referring to the foundation, but to our very family. Do you grasp the gravity of this? I held my ground. I am destroying nothing, Gabriel. I am merely divesting myself of something that never truly belonged to me. I am no longer an inheritor of this legacy. And, in your heart of hearts, you know this to be true. He remained silent for a protracted period, as if grappling with my words. And, before terminating the call, he simply uttered, I am at a loss. 4 words. You have clearly made your resolve. Indeed, I had. I was fully cognizant of the implications for my relationship with my brother. I knew that, from that moment forward, he would fail to comprehend my actions, but it no longer held any bearing. I was prepared to forge ahead, even if it meant doing so in solitude. The unanticipated reply arrived later that night. It was a letter from my father. I had anticipated he wouldn't simply let matters rest, and the letter's tone was that of a final, desperate plea to compel me to reconsider. He wrote about the foundation, the years of dedication he had poured into it, and how he was now witnessing its collapse due to my decision, but the most profound impact came from the letter's conclusion. He referred to me as the daughter who had lost her way. That phrase, which might have seemed innocuous to anyone else, cut me to the core. Not only did he blame me for the hardships he was enduring, but he also sought to diminish me. He failed to grasp that, contrary to his belief, I was not the lost daughter. I was, in fact, finally finding myself. I discarded the letter and picked up my phone. There was no more time to wait for him. Nothing more remained to be said. I called Rachel. I must act immediately. I cannot wait any longer. Let's proceed. Let's move forward with my complete disengagement from any affiliation with the foundation. I can no longer be a part of it. Rachel assured me that all matters were being addressed with the utmost efficiency and care, and that the legal ramifications would soon be set in motion. She also cautioned me about the forthcoming challenges, but now, I was more resolute than ever. My path was unequivocally clear, and nothing else held any significance beyond that. The following morning, I was keenly aware that the situation was poised to become even more fraught. The foundation's divestiture process was officially in motion, yet I sensed the pressure escalating with each passing day. My father was desperate to salvage his reputation, which implied he would strive relentlessly until the very last moment to compel me to recant. He had never hesitated to leverage his connections and position for manipulation and control, and I knew that propensity would not wane now. He would exert every effort to cast me as the architect of the foundation's demise. Solely accountable for its ruin, upon entering the office, I immediately perceived a shift in the atmosphere. There was a palpable tension in the air, one I found impossible to disregard. As I settled at my desk, one of the officials approached me, his expression etched with concern. "Emily, are you all right? I merely wanted to ascertain that you're not being unduly affected by external pressures. Don't allow them to compromise your work here," he uttered, plainly attempting to tread lightly. I met his gaze and offered a faint, yet genuine smile. "I am well. I simply lack the luxury of dwelling on such concerns at present. My work demands my full attention, and nothing will divert me from it." He nodded, still visibly perturbed, but took a step back. I understood he was merely attempting to shield me, yet, at my core, I knew there was no longer any scope for such protection. My sole focus was on forging ahead, on shedding all expectations, all manipulations. I was prepared to confront whatever lay ahead, unequivocally. My paramount concern, however, was what would transpire following the complete severance. I knew that, with the foundation's impending insolvency, my own reputation would inevitably be drawn into the maelstrom. It would be impossible to disregard the pivotal role I had played in the foundation's collapse, and I knew this would place me squarely at the epicenter of media scrutiny, likely precipitating more complications than I could currently fathom. That afternoon, I received a call from Rachel, her tone unmistakably grave. "Emily, the media is beginning to take a keen interest in the case. They've already commenced contacting your colleagues, scrutinizing your involvement with the foundation. And they're implying you possessed more knowledge than you disclosed. It's imperative that you brace yourself for this level of exposure." I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing the gravity of her words. I understood this was merely the nascent stage. The foundation teetered on the brink of collapse, and the media invariably sought a narrative complete with a discernible antagonist. I was to be the villain, of that, there was no doubt. But, however arduous it proved, I was ready. I knew that by making the decision to completely sever ties, I would be laying the groundwork for a new life, and there would be no turning back. "Rachel, I am prepared for this. It won't be easy, but nothing truly worthwhile ever is. Let's forge ahead with full commitment." A sigh escaped her on the other end of the line. "I know. I'll continue to monitor everything closely, but you must be prepared. They will try to thrust you into the narrative spotlight." "I know," I replied, my voice unwavering. "But ultimately, I am the sole architect of my own narrative now." The following morning presented a new challenge. Upon entering the office, my superior summoned me for a brief meeting. He appeared more strained than usual, seemingly unsure how to broach the subject with me. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Emily, we are aware of the developments concerning the foundation. Some of our closest colleagues are beginning to raise questions about your involvement. How are you handling this?" I recognized his attempt at diplomacy, his effort to sidestep a direct confrontation. However, to be frank, I had no patience left for these charades. I met his gaze and, without hesitation, stated, "I have nothing to conceal. I made the decision to disassociate myself from my father's foundation because it was the only righteous course of action. I am no longer affiliated with it." He regarded me for a moment, appraising my response. "I understand you've made a difficult choice, but what you mustn't overlook is that once the media begins to delve into this, your standing will be scrutinized. I recognize that your motives aren't financial gain or power, but appearances can be deceiving. I nodded, acknowledging his point. I am fully cognizant of that. However, frankly, it no longer holds any relevance. I chose to do what I believed was right for myself. Now, I need to move forward with my life. He remained silent for a moment, as if deliberating his next words. Ultimately, he stated, "Understood. Should you require anything at all, should you need support, know that you have it here." I expressed my gratitude, though I questioned whether I genuinely required their assistance. I was beginning to realize that I could no longer depend on anyone for anything. All I truly needed was myself. When the media finally broke my story, I knew things would never be the same. The inquiries began to pour in. The spotlight was squarely on me, and it was impossible to overlook the profound ramifications this would have for my career. Every interview I gave, every meeting I attended, I was treated as a pariah, as someone who had single-handedly dismantled the Harris family's legacy. I had anticipated this inevitability, but now, it was palpably real that I began to realize that nothing I could say would make a difference. The narrative had already been irrevocably cemented. And, as my name became inextricably linked to the Foundation's demise, I understood that the only recourse left to me was to press onward, without an iota of regret. That afternoon, a reporter arrived at the base for an interview. He wanted to discuss my relationship with the Foundation, the ramifications of my decision. I knew it would be arduous, but I also knew it would be an opportunity for me to finally speak my truth, unvarnished. So, when he began to interrogate me, I took a deep breath and responded without hesitation. I destroyed nothing. What I dismantled was a fabrication, an unrealistic expectation thrust upon me since birth. I was ensnared in a game that was never mine to play, and now I am breaking free from its shackles. If that means I am dismantling what my father built, then that is a reality he must confront, not I. He appeared visibly taken aback by my response. The interview continued with further inquiries, but deep down, I knew I was doing the right thing. I was beginning to reconstitute myself. And nothing, nor anyone, could impede me now. The ramifications of my actions began to grow increasingly evident, more burdensome, as the media delved deeper into every facet of my life and the Harris Foundation. What began as a straightforward decision to disassociate myself from a narrative that wasn't mine escalated into a maelstrom consuming everything in its wake. I hadn't anticipated the sheer difficulty of navigating this, but I also knew there was no turning back. Each step I took further distanced me from my father's legacy and, to some extent, from my family. I was, finally, witnessing the consequences of my choice. I knew it would come at a cost, but I also knew I could not continue sacrificing myself for something that had yielded nothing but frustration and rejection. The most arduous aspect was the disapproving gaze I began to receive from colleagues and even individuals I had considered friends. Everyone seemed to be anticipating me to become the scapegoat for the Foundation's entire downfall, and I knew I would have to bear this culpability, however unjust, until matters stabilized. It was then that an unexpected call came through. It was Rachel, my attorney, with an update on the progress of the legal proceedings. I knew things were deteriorating, but what she told me caught me off guard. "Emily, the Harris Foundation is attempting to pressure the bank into reversing your loan withdrawal. They allege you were manipulated by someone within the Foundation's management to make that decision. They are pulling out all the stops to hold you accountable. This could get considerably worse before it gets better." I felt the full import of her words. My father, undoubtedly, was doing everything in his power to manipulate the narrative. But what he didn't understand was that I was no longer a pawn in the game. I refused to be part of an empire built on a foundation of manipulation and deceit. "I'm not backing down, Rachel," I said, my voice resolute. "I know what I did, and I know it was the right thing. They'll try to implicate me, but I won't let that define me." Rachel sighed on the other end of the line. "I know, Emily, but you need to be prepared. They won't relent easily. The pressure on you will intensify. Brace yourself for more interviews, increased media scrutiny. They'll try to fabricate a narrative that serves their interests. I understand the stakes, I responded, gazing out at the horizon from my office window. But I am no longer Richard Harris's daughter. I am Emily Harris, and this is who I will be from this moment forward. She said nothing further, but I knew the struggle was far from its conclusion. I was beginning to feel as though I were on a battlefield, but the difference was that now I was fighting for my own convictions, for my truth, and nothing could compel me to retreat. Pressure began to mount as the process of extricating myself from the foundation dragged on longer than anticipated. The bank started to question the validity of my withdrawal as a co-signatory and whether there was any way to reverse the process. I knew my father was employing every conceivable means to exert pressure on me. He aimed to induce guilt in me. He wanted me to recant, to help him salvage what he had lost. But what he failed to grasp was that he was no longer in control of anything. Meetings grew increasingly tense, both professionally and personally. I knew the Harris name wouldn't be easily forgotten, and that was what troubled me most. I was being compelled to bear the burden of something I never desired, something that could no longer define who I was. The most challenging aspect was dealing with those around me who consistently viewed me with a mix of curiosity and distrust. I noticed the gazes, the whispers. I could no longer be Richard Harris's daughter, I needed to be myself. And that would not be easy. Those weeks dragged on like a relentless trial, and with each passing day, I felt an increasing urge to distance myself from everything. I knew that by doing so, I wasn't merely rejecting the foundation, but the entire notion of success that had been imposed upon me throughout my life. I was, at last, forging my own path. And in some way, this brought both a sense of relief and a simultaneous burden. It wouldn't be easy, but there was no other option. It was during a meeting with the team that I began to sense a tangible difference. Those around me were starting to perceive that I wasn't just engaged in a battle with my father or the foundation, but rather an internal struggle for my own liberation. I was beginning to garner more respect for the person I was evolving into. And although criticism still surfaced, and the media wouldn't leave me alone, I felt that the resistance was beginning to forge a new version of myself. The legal battle intensified, something within me began to solidify. I was starting to grasp the profound essence of freedom. Freedom wasn't merely the absence of responsibility, it was the capacity to make decisions unburdened by the incessant need to appease others. I was finally shedding the myriad expectations that had been thrust upon me, and in doing so, I was forging something inherently my own. The media, however, had not ceased its relentless probing. Reporters were infiltrating every conceivable space, intent on unearthing any fragment of my narrative that could be weaponized against me. They craved a villain. They wanted me to embody the ungrateful daughter, the woman who dismantled the foundation. Yet, I knew that by disengaging and seizing control of my own narrative, I was offering them nothing but the unvarnished truth. I was not the victim. I was the protagonist of my own story. Nevertheless, the repercussions on my Army career were far from negligible. Everyone was apprised of the unfolding events, and the news of my complete disassociation from my father's foundation had become common knowledge. Many questioned whether my public image and professional reputation would be irrevocably tarnished. I found myself under perpetual scrutiny. And as this transpired, I found myself increasingly engrossed in my work, committed to performing my duties with the same unwavering dedication as always. Yet, something had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer merely executing my tasks, I was carving out my own space, earning my respect. I knew that the edifice of my own legacy was only just beginning to be constructed. The days languished. The relentless media pressure, the pervasive surveillance of my every move, the utter dearth of privacy, it felt as though I was under constant observation with every step. The Harris Foundation was foundering, and my name remained inextricably linked to its collapse. Gabriel's calls grew more frequent, but increasingly, my responses became terser, more resolute. I was no longer willing to entertain further excuses or justify my actions. I knew precisely what I was doing, and I no longer required anyone's imprimatur. Yet, perhaps the most arduous aspect of it all was contending with the gazes of others, the stares of colleagues, superiors, and even individuals with whom I had collaborated for years. Distrust permeated every gesture, every unspoken word. I could discern in their eyes that they were attempting to pigeonhole me into a narrative that was fundamentally not my own, the saga of an ungrateful daughter, who tore her family apart through sheer obstinacy. This profoundly vexed me, yet simultaneously invigorated me. It was one of the final hurdles I needed to clear, the perception of others. I was slowly learning not to be so concerned with what people thought of me. But it was far from easy. The weight of external scrutiny was something I had not anticipated. I, who had always striven to be a pleaser, one who conformed to expectations, now found myself in uncharted territory. I was finally being my authentic self, unfiltered, uncompromising, and the reaction from those around me was far from positive. One morning, when the silence seemed deafening, I was summoned to an urgent meeting with my immediate superior. Colonel Davis regarded me with his customary calm demeanor, but I knew something momentous was about to unfold. He was about to hold me accountable, and I knew it. "Emily, I want you to know that I've been following the situation closely. And there's something critical we need to discuss. The repercussions of this foundation's decision are beginning to impinge upon your standing here. Are you aware of that?" I straightened in my chair and met his gaze. "Yes, Colonel, I am. There's nothing I can do to alter what has transpired. But I can assure you that my dedication to my work remains unwavering." He observed me for a moment, and after a protracted sigh, stated, "I know that, Emily. We all do. But you must understand that your personal choices are now impacting our operations here. This matter has ramifications throughout our entire unit." I knew he wasn't taking it personally. He was addressing the political implications, how image and reputation could compromise unit morale. But I also knew that my allegiance had always been to the Army and my mission. "I understand, Colonel. And those circumstances are shifting. My fealty to my work, the mission, and my team will not waver." He nodded, though he appeared unconvinced. "I certainly hope so, Emily. We all do." The conversation left a bitter taste in my mouth, yet it also rendered me more resolute than ever. I knew the paramount challenge now wasn't confronting my father or Gabriel. It was contending with the image that both the media and even my own institution were fabricating about me. I was no longer merely being appraised for my professional competence, but also for my association with the defunct foundation. The remainder of the week passed in a haze of interviews and further inquiries into my association with the foundation. I felt that, despite my steadfast demeanor and unperturbed responses, the gravitas of the situation was beginning to take its toll. I was no longer merely grappling with my family's judgment. I was under global scrutiny, and this made me feel vulnerable in an unaccustomed manner. The only thing that kept me anchored was my work. I immersed myself entirely in my endeavors. My operations were running with unprecedented efficiency, and I knew my team held me in high regard. It was my sanctuary. And when the emotional burden became overwhelming, I focused on the tasks, on the actions within my control. The rest, the external judgment, was something I was learning to relinquish, but the worst was yet to come. That it was during a team meeting that my phone rang. It was Rachel again. Her tone was distinct. "Emily, we need to talk. The bank has received immense pressure from the foundation, and they're beginning to demand your accountability extends beyond merely the withdrawal of your collateral." A surge of panic began to well up within me, but I forced myself to maintain composure. "What exactly are you implying?" "They are alleging you had knowledge of the mismanagement of funds. They're claiming you, in some capacity, actively participated in the decision-making. And they are using your name to try and salvage the foundation's public image." I closed my eyes, a surge of indignation rising within me. "That's a fabrication. They know I was never privy to the foundation's decisions. I was never consulted on any matter, save for the loan." "I know, Emily. And I will advocate for you. But you need to be prepared. They will weaponize everything against you. Even the fact that you are Richard Harris's daughter." I knew my connection to my father would be leveraged against me. He had always been the public face of the foundation, and I was being perceived as the daughter who orchestrated its downfall. It was inconsequential that I had no involvement in the Foundation's internal machinations. The name was paramount. I am prepared, Rachel. Just do whatever is necessary to safeguard my legal standing. She paused. We'll handle this. Rest assured. As pressure mounted, the media grew increasingly aggressive. Interviews and public statements, consistently linking my name to the downfall of the Harris Foundation, began to surface. The narrative being spun was not my own, yet everyone seemed to readily believe it. I was being painted as the villain, the ungrateful daughter who had destroyed the family's legacy. Every question posed to me seemed laced with an accusatory tone. Were you aware of what was transpiring within the Foundation? How does it feel to be held responsible for the collapse of an institution you helped establish? Do you not regret withdrawing your guarantee, knowing it would yield such a result? I knew it was only a matter of time before they began to attack me personally. They were seeking something more, something that could ultimately bring about my downfall. I refused to play their game. When the next interview arrived, my response was direct and unequivocal. No, I was not privy to what was happening within the Foundation. I distanced myself from it because I witnessed what was unfolding and knew I could no longer be part of something so mismanaged. I am not accountable for that. I am not to blame for the Foundation's insolvency. My name should not be used to mask someone else's missteps. I was weary of hiding. Weary of being blamed for something I did not do. It was time to seize control of my narrative, and I would no longer fear anyone who sought to destroy me. In the days following the interview, my life became consumed by a whirlwind of legal consultations, further interviews, and, crucially, the unbearable pressure of attempting to find some semblance of peace amidst it all. The media still hounded me, and stories about me continued to be released, but, for some reason, I was beginning to acclimate to the idea of being perceived as the villain of the narrative. It was no longer about what others thought, but about what I knew to be true. Gabriel, who for a time seemed to have distanced himself, began to resurface. His messages were becoming more frequent, and when he finally called me, I knew it was a last-ditch effort to bring me back into the family fold. But I was resolute in not retreating. There was no longer any room for him to manipulate me or for me to feel guilty about my choices. Emily, what you're doing is not right. You've destroyed everything. The Foundation is collapsing, and you're going to ruin your own life. I fail to see how this can possibly end well for you, he said, his voice laden with frustration. I sighed, feeling a weight on my chest. He didn't understand, he never would. But now, I no longer needed his approval. Gabriel, I'm not destroying anything. I am liberating myself. You'll understand this one day, but now is not the time. You're wrong, Emily. You've always been so stubborn. This is going to end badly. For all of us, he said, already visibly exasperated. I took a deep breath and, in a calm tone, said, I know what I'm doing. And, however difficult it may be for you to accept, what I did was the right thing. I will no longer be part of a legacy that fails to represent me. I heard silence on the other end of the line, and before he could say anything else, I hung up. I no longer had the patience to argue with him, nor to justify my actions. I was determined to follow my own path, and that included severing any ties that bound me to the past. What ensued was a period of profound isolation. I was indifferent to the stares, the gossip, or the judgments. I had already come to terms with the fact that my decision to sever ties with my father and the Harris Foundation had placed me in a challenging predicament, but it was precisely how things needed to unfold. I was asserting control over my life. And in doing so, I was beginning to grasp the true essence of independence. Internal briefings at the base were becoming more frequent, with all eyes fixed on me. I knew I was under intense scrutiny, perpetually judged. While some of my superiors attempted to approach the situation with tact, for the most part, it seemed the army itself was fractured on how to proceed with me. I was no longer part of the familial circle connected to the Harris Foundation, yet. Simultaneously, I was being held accountable for what had transpired. The Harris name remained inextricably linked to everything I undertook, and it appeared impossible to eradicate. Yet, deep down, I knew I was emancipating myself from its grip. During a briefing with my team, one of the officers approached me and, with a genuine smile, stated, "Emily, I know things are challenging, but you've been performing exceptionally. Your leadership has been pivotal. I just wanted you to know that we are all firmly behind you." This gesture of solidarity was what made me realize, once and for all, that what truly mattered was how I perceived myself and how my team perceived me. External opinions might attempt to undermine me, but I was beginning to construct something far more substantial and authentic. That night, as I contemplated all that was unfolding, I resolved to take an even bolder step. I needed to undertake something that embodied my new phase, my authentic identity. It was then, on impulse, that I called Rachel. "Rachel, I want to do something more. Something definitive." Knowing full well my resolve, she inquired, "What do you have in mind?" "I want to change my name. I want to leave Harris behind once and for all," I stated with conviction. Rachel hesitated for a moment, as if deliberating the ramifications of such a decision. However, she then responded in a composed tone, "I understand. If that is your decision, we will ensure it's done properly. I'll begin working on the documentation immediately." The sensation of resolving to change my name was akin to a tremendous weight being lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was making a decision for myself, unencumbered by anyone's directives. I was forging my own identity. Finally, I was prepared to shed everything associated with the Harris name, thereby making room for a new iteration of myself. The paperwork for the official transition was being prepared. External pressure appeared to be subsiding. The media began to lose interest, perhaps because the narratives concerning my connection to the foundation had already been exhausted, or perhaps because they were seeking fresh content to consume. Yet, for me, this abatement in external scrutiny did not signify that matters were resolved. Indeed, the true battle was just commencing. Deep down, I knew that my newfound freedom came at a price. I had distanced myself from all that was familiar and comfortable, and, in the process, I began to apprehend that, in a sense, this alienated me from anyone who could offer genuine support. Isolation was an inherent outcome of my decision, but I could not allow it to debilitate me. I began to realize that while the media and my family sought to judge and label me, I had to remain singularly focused on my mission. The Army, my career, my closest friends, these were the true pillars upon which I was constructing my new life. The formal adoption of a new name would be the definitive watershed moment for my identity, leaving no further room for the specters of the past. The transformation would not occur overnight, but it was being meticulously constructed, step by step, and I was finally in command of its trajectory. When the new name, Emily Walker, was legally ratified, a profound sense of relief enveloped me. It was no longer about what the foundation represented or about my father's approbation. It was about who I was now, and who I aspired to become. The days following the interview, my life became consumed by a whirlwind of legal consultations, more interviews, and, crucially, the unsustainable pressure of trying to find some semblance of peace amidst it all. The media still hounded me, and stories about me continued to surface, but for some reason, I was beginning to reconcile myself to the notion of being cast as the villain of the narrative. It was no longer about what others thought, but about what I knew to be true. Gabriel, who for a time had seemed to distance himself, began to resurface. His messages grew more frequent, and when he finally called, I knew it was a last-ditch effort to pull me back into the family fold. But I was resolved not to backtrack. There was no longer any room for him to manipulate me or for me to feel guilt over my choices. "Emily, what you're doing isn't right. You've destroyed everything. The foundation is crumbling, and you're going to ruin your own life. I don't see how this can end well for you," he said, his voice laden with frustration. I sighed, feeling a weight in my chest. He didn't understand, he never would. But now, I no longer needed his validation. "Gabriel, I'm not destroying anything. I'm liberating myself. You'll understand that one day, but now isn't the time. You're wrong, Emily. You've always been so stubborn. "This is going to end badly for all of us," he said, already visibly exasperated. I took a deep breath, and in a calm tone, I said, "I know what I'm doing. And, however difficult it may be for you to accept, what I did was the right thing. I will no longer be part of a legacy that doesn't represent me." I heard the silence on the other end of the line, and before he could utter another word, I hung up. I no longer had the patience to argue with him, nor to justify my actions. I was determined to forge my own path, and that included severing any ties that bound me to the past. What ensued was a period of profound solitude. I was unconcerned by the scrutiny, the gossip, or the judgments. I had already accepted that my decision to sever ties with my father and the Harris Foundation had placed me in a precarious position, but it was a necessary step. I was reclaiming control of my life, and in doing so, I was beginning to grasp the true essence of independence. Internal meetings at the base were becoming more frequent, with all eyes fixed on me. I knew I was being scrutinized, judged. While some of my superiors attempted to approach the situation with tact, it largely appeared that the Army itself was fractured on how to handle me. I was no longer part of the familial circle connected to the Harris Foundation, yet simultaneously, I was being held accountable for what had transpired. The Harris name remained inextricably linked to everything I did, and it seemed impossible to expunge. Yet, deep down, I knew I was emancipating myself from its grasp. During a briefing with my team, one of the officers approached me and, with a genuine smile, stated, "Emily, I know things are challenging, but you've been performing exceptionally. Your leadership has been pivotal. I just wanted you to know we're all standing with you." This gesture of support solidified, once and for all, that what truly mattered was my self-perception and how my team perceived me. External opinions might attempt to undermine me, but I was beginning to forge something far more robust and authentic. That night, as I reflected upon the unfolding events, I resolved to take an even bolder step. I needed to undertake an action that would embody my new phase, my true identity. It was then that, on impulse, I telephoned Rachel. "Rachel, I wish to do something more. Something definitive." Already apprised of my determination, she inquired, "What do you have in mind?" "I intend to change my name. I want to leave Harris behind," unequivocally, I stated with conviction. Rachel hesitated for a moment, as if contemplating the ramifications of such a decision. But then, she responded with a composed tone, "I understand. If this is your resolution, we shall proceed appropriately. I will commence work on the documentation immediately." The sensation of resolving to change my name was akin to a substantial burden being lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was making a decision solely for myself, unburdened by external influence. I was forging my own distinct identity. At long last, I was prepared to shed everything that had been associated with the Harris name, and in doing so, give rise to a new iteration of myself. The documents were being prepared for the official transition. External pressure seemed to be subsiding. The media began to lose interest, perhaps because the narratives surrounding my connection to the foundation had already been exhausted, or perhaps because they were seeking fresh content to consume. However, for me, this decline in external scrutiny did not signify that matters were resolved. In fact, the true struggle was just commencing. Deep down, I knew that my newfound freedom came at a cost. I had distanced myself from everything familiar and comfortable, and, in the process, began to realize that, in a way, this alienated me from anyone who could offer genuine support. Isolation was a natural consequence of my decision, but I could not allow it to debilitate me. I began to comprehend that while the media and my family sought to judge and pigeonhole me, I had to focus on my mission. The Army, my career, my closest friends, these were the veritable pillars upon which I was constructing my new life. The name change would be the definitive turning point for my identity, leaving no further room for the specters of the past. The transformation would not occur overnight, but it was being forged, step by step, and I was finally in control of it. When the new name, Emily Walker, was officially recognized, a profound sense of relief enveloped me. It was no longer about what the foundation represented or about seeking my father's imprimatur. It was about who I am now, and who I aspired to become. The name change was a watershed moment. From that instant, the name Harris ceased to exist in my life. When I began using Emily Walker, the sensation of liberation was indescribable. I knew that, with this alteration, I was also forging a new future for myself. My father's name, the legacy he sought to impose upon me, was finally cast aside. I was now simply Emily Walker, a woman capable of constructing her own narrative, unburdened by the expectations of others. Initially, the transition proved challenging. I felt the scrutinizing gazes of people, striving to reconcile themselves with the notion that Harris's daughter was distancing herself from her heritage. Some, however, began to discern the inherent strength behind my decision. They started to perceive me not merely as Colonel Richard Harris's daughter, but as a leader in my own right. The Army began to regard me differently, no longer with the stigma of the famous colonel's daughter, but rather as a competent and dedicated officer. My colleagues afforded me greater respect. I had proven to myself that I could advance, build a career, without relying on the name I had been given yet. Despite this, it was not facile. I knew the specters of the past still lingered. My family still attempted to manipulate me. I remained under duress. Gabriel, in particular, failed to grasp the magnitude of my decision. He could not comprehend that I was not merely disengaging from the past, but liberating myself for a more authentic future. He persisted in his attempts, through calls and messages, to convince me I was mistaken. Emily, you cannot persist like this. You are alienating yourself from everything of consequence. We cannot move forward without you, he asserted, his voice brimming with frustration. I could no longer maintain my composure. Gabriel, I have articulated everything there is to say. I am not dismantling the family. I am simply disassociating myself from a narrative that is not my own. It is no longer about what you desire for me, but what I desire for myself. He remained silent for a moment, then uttered, almost in a whisper, you won't recant, will you? No, I replied, my voice resolute. My decision has been made. The conversation concluded under the weight of mutual disillusionment. Gabriel, on the one hand, striving to comprehend my actions. I, on the other, finally realizing that to advance, I would have to relinquish what I had always envisioned as my family. This even encompassed the love and loyalty I bore for them. I was poised to forge a new narrative, and if that entailed severing all ties, then I was prepared to pay the price. The process of reconstructing my identity was gradual. Following the name change, I began to focus on my military career. I was being perceived differently, with greater respect and strength than before. My team started to view me as a genuine leader, and their confidence was what most empowered me to persevere. I knew there would still be repercussions. The media relentlessly pursued me. But now, instead of retreating, I was beginning to grasp how to navigate it. I no longer feared exposure. I was already being assailed and discredited, but what truly mattered was my own self-perception. I no longer required validation from my family or society. Gradually, I reclaimed control over my life. I began to realize that true strength lay in not depending on anyone else for my happiness or success. The decision I made to distance myself from my father and the foundation was, in fact, the key to discovering my own voice. And while the ramifications were significant, there was a burgeoning sense of inner peace. It wasn't merely about the name. It was about finally comprehending that I could be whoever I desired, not who others expected me to be. This instilled in me unshakable confidence, and it was this that propelled me through the ensuing months. I began to formulate plans for the future, for my career, for the life I had always envisioned, free from external pressures. It was during one of those mornings that matters finally began to settle down. I was in a strategic planning meeting when a notification popped up on my phone. It was from Rachel. She sent me a file outlining the current status of the investigations and legal proceedings. The bank had finally ceased pressing for my liability. And my father's foundation was now being treated as an inevitable bankruptcy. My name, while still associated with the situation for a period, was gradually being disassociated. Emily, we've finally managed to overturn the legal proceedings. Your father's foundation is officially bankrupt. There's nothing else they can use against you. The bank has withdrawn all accusations related to you, Rachel messaged me. The sense of relief that washed over me was profound, but, concurrently, a wave of sadness accompanied it. I knew my father was now facing the repercussions of his own missteps, and that I could no longer serve as his lifeline. Yet, simultaneously, the feeling of liberation and of justice being served was what truly emboldened me. I was no longer alone on this journey. Henceforth, it was time to forge ahead, unburdened, unencumbered by guilt, and free from external attempts to shape me. The most significant lesson I gleaned from these months of struggle was the true strength that emanates from staying true to oneself. I had spent my entire life striving to please others, attempting to meet the expectations of my father, of society, of Gabriel. But now, I was finally authoring my own narrative. And, however arduous it proved to be, this afforded me a serenity I had never before experienced. My military career flourished. Not because I was endeavoring to prove something to anyone, but because I was truly in command now. I finally knew what I desired and what was requisite to attain my objectives. And this, more than anything, elucidated for me that I was capable of far more than I had ever envisioned. With every new accomplishment, every fresh challenge, I was demonstrating, not merely to others, but to myself, that I possessed the power to become the woman I had always aspired to be. I no longer languished under the shadow of the Harris name. I was Emily Walker, and that was the sole identity I required. The dissolution of the Harris Foundation heralded, for many, the conclusion of an era. Yet, for me, it marked the genesis of something entirely new. A profound sense of relief and liberation engulfed me as never before. I was finally unburdened, free to forge my own path, unchained from the legacy that had never truly defined me. The Army served as my bedrock during this period. Despite the external tribulations, within my profession, I was thriving. I knew that the trust my team reposed in me stemmed not from a celebrated surname, but from my own actions, my choices. And that held greater significance than anything my father or anyone else could have ever bestowed upon me. Over the ensuing months, the rumors surrounding me began to abate. The investigations into the Harris Foundation finally culminated, and the media, which had previously pursued me relentlessly, began to shift its focus to other narratives. I knew, deep down, that what remained from all this turbulence was the unvarnished truth. I had made the correct decision. I had unshackled myself from a life that was never truly mine to begin constructing something entirely novel. Yet the newfound liberty I now relished also ushered in unforeseen challenges. With the forfeiture of my name and the estrangement from my family, I began to feel, in a sense, isolated. I understood that, by making these decisions, I was erecting a barrier between myself and those who had once been integral to my life, but I also recognized that I could no longer afford to dwell on it. My paramount concern now was to embody the best version of myself. On one of those serene days, I was summoned for an off-base assignment. I knew that, beyond a mere operation, this mission would present an opportunity to test my mettle once again. The team was relying on me to spearhead a high-stakes operation, and, to my astonishment, it made me feel more alive than ever before. As the mission dawned, my mind was singularly focused. There was no room for doubt, nor for apprehension. I was no longer contending with the burden of a name or a narrative that was not my own. I was there, with my team, to execute what I did best. The mission proved arduous, demanding, yet we successfully brought it to fruition. The respect I garnered from my team, more than any commendation, was the affirmation I needed to confirm I was on the right trajectory. It was during that mission I gleaned how profoundly emotional and mental liberation resonated in my work. I was more focused, more resilient, and my leadership was unfolding more organically. I was no longer striving to conform to a mold. I was simply being my authentic self, and, in doing so, I was inspiring others to follow suit. I returned to base, imbued with a renewed sense of confidence. The mission had proven successful, and I had demonstrated to myself that, unburdened by the weight of my past, I was capable of achieving far more. Yet, what truly struck me was the profound shift in how I began to be perceived. No longer merely Harris's daughter, but as Emily Walker, an unequivocal leader in every sense of the word. It was at that precise juncture that, for the very first time, I felt my authentic identity fully emerging. It ceased to be about seeking familial approval or conforming to an imposed legacy. It was about authentically embodying who I truly was, irrespective of external expectations. And in doing so, I unearthed a profound strength I had never realized I possessed. The narrative of my life had been fundamentally redefined. Not as a colonel's daughter, but as a woman who had emancipated herself from the fetters of a legacy that was incongruent with her true self. I was forging my own legacy, and this legacy was not predicated on power, status, or renown. It was about integrity, honesty, and, fundamentally, about possessing the courage to be my authentic self, even when the world sought to compel me into another mold. With each passing day, my sense of liberation intensified. The media, which had once relentlessly pursued me, now appeared to have exhausted its capacity to diminish me. I had achieved a profound sense of inner peace. The following evening, post-mission, I headed to a small restaurant near the base. I went alone, not feeling the need for companionship, and found a moment of profound tranquility. I settled at a table, ordered a glass of wine, and let my gaze drift out onto the street. I wasn't entirely certain what the future held for me, but for the first time in a very long time, I was genuinely at peace with it. I was in control. I was resolute. The waiter served me, a message flashed across my phone screen. It was from Rachel, and its tone made me momentarily pause. She informed me of a prospective final settlement with the foundation. The bankruptcy was confirmed, and any lingering liabilities that might have fallen upon me were officially being dismissed. This confirmation brought with it a sigh of relief, but it was no longer the desperate kind of relief I had experienced before. It was a relief stemming from the profound certainty that what had transpired in the past no longer dictated who I was. The evening unfolded peacefully, and as the wine slowly descended, I felt the immense weight I had carried for so long finally dissipate. I no longer needed to justify my existence to anyone. I no longer needed to dread the disapproval of my family or others. I was at peace. When the waiter presented the check, I looked at the table and realized I had truly left many things behind. The Harris name, the foundation, my father's legacy. But ultimately, none of that defined me anymore. What defined me now was what I would choose to become from this moment forward. The following month ushered in a new phase for my career, an opportunity for promotion. The recognition of my arduous work, without the need to leverage my family's name, was finally being acknowledged. My father's promises, society's expectations, all of it was being surpassed. And now, my leadership and my decisions were speaking for themselves. I was, at last, earning the respect I deserved, not because I was the daughter of someone famous, but because I had worked, struggled, and proven myself on my own merits. People began to view me differently. And, more importantly, I started to view myself differently. The atmosphere at the base began to shift. I was no longer seen as the daughter of, a moniker that had, for so long, relentlessly defined me. Now, everyone saw Emily Walker, the respected officer who had weathered a personal storm to achieve her goals. What surprised me was how genuinely comfortable I felt with this new iteration of myself. I knew the path to this point hadn't been easy, but now it was revealing itself as the only one that made sense. The promotion I had received wasn't merely external validation. It was, in fact, the confirmation of something I had always known but never quite articulated. I no longer needed anyone's approval. My strength lay in my capacity to advocate for myself, in my competence as a leader, in my determination to leave behind the shadows of the past and forge something new. In recent months, the weight of my father's legacy and the Harris family name had been diminishing, but a part of me still felt a certain emptiness. It wasn't an emptiness of regret, but a void of connection. I knew my decision to distance myself, to sever all ties with the past, was correct. Yet, simultaneously, something told me that I could never achieve true reconciliation with my brother. Nor with my father. This was a burden I would have to bear. The disengagement was permanent. But it was also liberating. I was in a meeting with my team when the door opened and my commanding officer, Colonel Davis, entered. He observed me for a moment before speaking. "Emily, I have an important mission for you. Are you ready to undertake a greater challenge?" I met his gaze, feeling a surge of confidence and adrenaline. "Yes, Colonel. Whatever you need." He smiled faintly, recognizing that I had reached a point of maturity and self-assurance. "The mission is high risk, but I know you possess what is necessary to rise to the occasion. I'm entrusting this to you." The challenge before me was not merely a mission, but an opportunity to cement my position within the Army, and more significantly, in my life. A chance to validate myself once more, but this time, not for the approval of others. For myself, the mission was intricate, and the nights dedicated to planning began to mount. During each briefing session, my confidence solidified. I was working impeccably, focused, and, upon observing my team members, I realized they trusted me more than they ever had before. I began to grasp the extent to which my perspective had shifted since the inception of my journey. Previously, I had been burdened by the expectations of others. Now, all that propelled me was the desire to be the best version of myself, free from the specters of my father, unburdened by the weight of the Harris name. This granted me liberation. And freedom, as I had discovered, was the most profound strength a person could possess. When we finally prepared for the mission, the tension was palpable. The operation would be fraught, with little room for error, and as the hours passed, I felt a peculiar excitement growing within me. Every step, every movement, was completely under my control. I had prepared for that moment my entire life, and now I was ready. The mission unfolded with precision. Although there were unforeseen challenges, my team and I successfully completed the task. What impressed me most was not the success of the mission itself, but the genuine respect I earned from my superiors and colleagues. I was no longer seen as someone bearing a famous name, but as a strong, competent leader, capable of making difficult decisions and guiding them on the right path. Upon our return to base, Colonel Davis summoned me. "You did an excellent job, Emily. I knew I could count on you. Your competence and leadership are remarkable." I smiled, knowing he was now seeing the true version of me, not the shadow of what I once was. "Thank you, Colonel. I'm just doing my job." He looked at me for a moment and said, "Yes, and you're doing it better than many. Keep it up. You have a brilliant future ahead of you." Upon returning to the office, a profound sense of accomplishment enveloped me. I knew that the mission was not merely a professional milestone, but an affirmation that I was truly heading in the right direction. I no longer required anyone's validation. No more shadows loomed over me. I was forging a legacy, not of fame or fortune, but of respect and authenticity. Several weeks later, I received an unexpected call from Rachel. She was bearing good news. "Emily, the legal proceedings against your father's foundation have been concluded. There are no longer any legal repercussions for you. All that remains now is the foundation's bankruptcy and the severing of any direct connection to it." I remained silent for a moment, absorbing her words. There was such immense relief in that moment, but also a tinge of sadness. In a way, it confirmed that my past and my family were irretrievably distant from me now. But I knew this was not something I would need to bear any longer. "Thank you, Rachel. This truly marks the close of a chapter. Now it's time to focus on the next." She smiled on the other end of the line, knowing that despite the hardships I had faced, I had finally achieved my peace. "Yes, it's time to move forward, Emily. And for everything you've done, you deserve far more than you can possibly imagine." I hung up the phone and looked out my office window. The sun was setting on the horizon, and I knew that the future would be what I made of it. There was nothing left to hold me back. I was free to move forward, to author my own destiny. Months elapsed, and the story of Emily Harris, or rather, Emily Walker, began to unfold differently. People now perceived her as a true leader, someone who surmounted adversity and forged her own path. I no longer needed to concern myself with my family's opinions or with the burden of the name I once bore. I was finally at peace with myself, the promotions continued their ascent, and with each new achievement, I felt more empowered. I had shed the pressure to please others, to embody something I was not. The Army had offered me the platform for growth, but it was my own unwavering determination that propelled me to my current standing. I knew the future was mine for the taking, and no one could any longer impede me from achieving everything I had always desired. The name Harris may have been what ushered me into the world, but Emily Walker would be the name that defined my legacy. Not the legacy of an empire built on fame and power, but the legacy of a woman who possessed the fortitude to break free from a past that did not belong to her, and meticulously crafted something genuine and authentic for herself. And it was thus that, in the end, I discovered that true power does not reside in bearing the burdens of others, but in the capacity to forge one's own identity and, ultimately, live in harmony with oneself. Time had passed, and looking back, I realized that every challenging moment had guided me to this juncture of insight and evolution. I had, at long last, struck a balance between being a respected officer and a woman who had broken free from the shackles of the past. The person I had become was far stronger and more authentic than the Emily Harris of yesteryear, and I knew I would never be the same after all I had experienced. I still met with Rachel periodically, discussing my options and what the future might hold for me. But now, our conversations no longer revolved around navigating the repercussions of my decision to step away from the foundation or my family. They were about the future, about what I aimed to achieve in the coming years, and how I could continue to evolve. I had distanced myself from the shadow of the past. Now, however, I was eager to explore a new future.